Have you ever wondered if that brightly colored cereal your kid loves, or maybe that snack, could be doing more than just staining their fingers?
It's a thought a lot of people have had, yeah. And it's not exactly new either.
Right.
Yeah, this concern goes way back, all the way to the 1970s. This persistent question about artificial colors in food and maybe a link to, kids' behavior, focus, energy levels, that kind of thing.
It's like it's just been simmering there for ages.
Exactly.
So today we're really digging into that. We're looking at the potential impact of these synthetic food dyes on activity and attention in children.
And the basis for this deep dive is this really comprehensive review done by the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. OEI, let's call them.
OEA, got it. Saves a mouthful.
Right. And they basically pull together, everything they could find. Human studies, animal toxicology studies, trying to get the full picture from the science.
So they looked at research on actual kids and lab animals.
Precisely. And the scope was pretty significant. We're talking 27 clinical trials involving children.
Yep.
And what's really useful here is that 25 of those were challenge studies. Many also used a crossover design.
Okay, challenge studies, crossover design, those sound important. Can we unpack those a bit? Why do they matter here?
Good question. So a challenge study basically means the kids are actually given the food dyes, right?
Yeah.
And researchers watch for any behavioral changes.
Makes sense.
Now, the crossover part is, I think, a real strength. Imagine each child in the study gets both the real dye and a placebo, a dummy pill or drink at different times. So each child acts as their own comparison.
So you're comparing the same kid with and without the dye.
Exactly. It helps minimize individual differences between kids and really isolates the effect of the dye itself. It's a pretty rigorous way to look at this.
That makes a lot of sense. And were these studies all done in one place, just California?
Oh, no, not at all. They were actually spread out: US, UK, Australia, Canada. So it gives a broader view across different places. And the average study size was around 44 kids.
Okay, so decent numbers spread across different countries. How did they measure the kids' behavior? Was it just observation?
It was more structured than that usually. Most studies started with an elimination diet during the trial.
To clear the slate, kind of?
Yeah, exactly. To rule out other food factors.
Yeah.
Then, for measuring behavior, they often use what we call validated metrics.
Okay.
These are basically scientifically tested questionnaires or rating scales designed to reliably measure behavior. One that popped up a lot was the Connor's Parent Scale.
So parents filling out detailed reports.
That's right. Parents reporting on their child's behavior.
Okay, so it sounds like these human studies were pretty carefully done. When Oicha looked at all 25 of those challenge studies together, what was the big takeaway, the bottom line?
Well, the central finding is pretty striking, actually. A significant chunk of about 64% of those 25 studies showed some kind of positive association.
Meaning a link between the dyes and worse behavior.
Yes, adverse behavioral outcomes. And get this, in over half of them, 52%, that link was statistically significant.
Statistically significant. Okay, remind us what that means in simple terms. Why is that important?
Right, so statistically significant basically means it's unlikely the result they saw just happened by random chance. It suggests there's probably a real effect happening. So finding that in over half the studies, that's a pretty strong signal.
Wow, yeah, that does sound strong. But you said some evidence where there are nuances in there, things that stood out.
Absolutely, and this is where it gets really interesting. One key thing was who was doing the reporting.
The parents using the Connors scale?
Right. They found the links were more often picked up when parents were the ones reporting. In fact, they looked at 8 studies that compared parent reports and teacher reports. And in 4 of those 8, the link was only found when looking at the parent reports.
Huh. That's fascinating. Why would parents see it, but maybe not teachers?
Well, it could be about context, right? Parents see their kids in way more situations: home, meals, playing, weekends. Teachers mostly see them in the classroom, which is more structured.
Right, different environments.
Yeah, maybe the effects are just more noticeable in those less structured settings. Plus, parents know their kids' baseline. They have that long history.
That makes a lot of sense. You also mentioned that more recent studies were finding these links more often. after 1990.
That's right. The OEHA review did note that trend. Studies post-1990 seemed more likely to report associations.
Any idea why? Better methods or?
That could definitely be part of it. Maybe using those validated metrics more consistently, like we talked about. Or maybe larger studies, bigger sample sizes, which makes it easier to detect effects, even smaller ones.
Oh, okay. And what about preservatives? You often find dyes with preservatives in foods. Could that be muddying the waters?
That's a really important question. And yes, some studies did use mixtures of dyes and preservatives.
Right.
But OEHA highlighted that many others actually, over half of the ones showing a positive link, found associations with the dyes alone.
Oh, okay.
10 of those even showed statistically significant links just to the synthetic dyes themselves.
So it really does seem to point towards the dye specifically, not just other stuff they're paired with. Now, you mentioned one specific study earlier, Row and Row, yellow number 5.
Yes, Row and Row, 1994. That one was really noteworthy because they actually showed a dose-response relationship.
Meaning the more dye, the bigger the effect.
Exactly. With yellow number 5, also called tartrazine, they gave kids different amounts from just 1 milligram a day up to 50 milligrams.
Yeah.
And they saw that as the dose of yellow number 5 went up, the behavioral scores got worse, specifically in kids already identified as being sensitive to food additives.
Wow, a dose response. That feels like stronger evidence, doesn't it? How was that study set up?
It was very well controlled, double-blind, so nobody knew who got what. Placebo-controlled repeated measures, meaning kids got all the different doses and the placebo. They had 34 kids with hyperactivity concerns and 20 control kids.
Right.
And crucially, everyone was on a dye-free diet beforehand, and parents did daily behavior ratings. Really solid design.
Sounds like it. What about bigger picture analyses? You know, when researchers combine lots of studies, meta-analyses.
Yep, OEHA pointed to one by Nig and colleagues from 2012, a meta-analysis, just like you said, pooling results from multiple studies.
And what did Nig find?
They also found support for that link between synthetic food dyes and adverse behavioral effects. They even put a number on it, estimating that maybe 8% of kids with ADHD might have symptoms related to these dyes.
8%. That's not insignificant. How big were the effects compared to, say, ADHD medication?
Good question for perspective. Nig's team estimated the effect size from dyes was about 1/6 to 1/3 of the improvement you typically see with ADHD meds.
Okay, so smaller than meds for most, but still noticeable for potentially 8% of those kids.
Exactly. It's a factor to consider, even if it's not the whole picture for most kids with ADHD.
Right. Now, looking at all this research, there's always the question of bias, right? Or other things influencing the results. How did OEHA handle that?
That's critical, absolutely. They looked closely at potential bias and confounding. The strength of those crossover placebo-controlled designs helps a lot with minimizing bias.
Sure.
And they also did something called a sensitivity analysis.
Yeah.
Basically, they reran the numbers using only the highest quality studies, double-blind, randomized crossover, and the main conclusions held up. They still found the association. That adds quite a bit of confidence.
Good to know they were thorough. Now, we know not all kids react badly. It seems like some are more susceptible. Do we know why?
That's a huge area for more research. OEHA noted that just focusing on kids already diagnosed with hyperactivity didn't necessarily make studies more likely to find a link. But one study, Stevenson et al., from 2010, found something interesting with genetics. They saw that certain variations in genes involved in breaking down histamine.
Histamine? Like in allergies?
Yeah, but histamine is also a neurotransmitter in the brain, involved in things like alertness. They found variations in those histamine genes were linked to bigger adverse reactions to dyes in some kids.
Interesting.
And they saw something similar with genes related to dopamine transport in older children. Dopamine's involved in focus, reward.
Ah, so maybe some kids are genetically wired to be more sensitive because of how their brains handle these chemicals when dyes are introduced.
That's the idea, potentially. It suggests a genetic predisposition, but like I said, we definitely need more research to really nail down those connections.
Okay, that's a lot on the human side. Let's switch gears to the animal studies OEHA reviewed. Why look at animals too? What do they add?
The animal studies add another really valuable layer. I mean, obviously human research is most direct, but animals let you explore things you can't easily or ethically do in kids.
Like what?
Like looking at potential mechanisms, how the dyes might be working, or looking at really long-term effects or effects of exposure during development, even before birth.
Right, things you just can't test in children. And did the animal studies point in the same direction? Did they show behavioral effects?
They did, yes. Oicha found quite a few animal toxicology studies reporting neurobehavioral effects. Things like changes in motor development, how their movement skills progressed, and also effects on learning and memory.
Similar signals to the human studies then. Now, the review mentioned something about the FDA's safety limits for these dyes, the ADIs. They're pretty old.
That's a really critical piece of context. The current acceptable daily intakes, the ADIs, for these dyes, they were mostly set back in the 1960s to the 1980s.
Wow, decades ago.
Yeah, and importantly, they were based mainly on general toxicology studies, looking for obvious signs of harm, like organ damage. They weren't specifically designed to detect the kind of subtle neurobehavioral effects we're talking about now.
So the original safety net might have had holes when it comes to brain and behavior effects?
That's the concern, exactly. Our science has moved on since then. These animal studies OHA looked at have brought new information.
Like what specifically?
Well, some looked at long-term effects of exposure during pregnancy.
That seems really important.
Definitely. Others looked at effects in adult animals after short or long-term exposure, and effects during juvenile or adolescent periods, key times for brain development.
Okay. And what kind of behavioral changes did they see in the animals?
It varied, but things like altered motor skills, changes in activity levels, sometimes more active, sometimes less, and problems with learning and memory tasks. Interestingly, some studies even tested if giving antioxidants could prevent some of these effects.
Antioxidants helping. That hints at how the dyes might be causing problems, right? Maybe oxidative stress.
It does suggest that possibility, yeah.
Yeah.
And the newer research is starting to look right at the brain, finding actual physical changes linked to the behavior changes.
Like what kind of changes?
Things like changes in the volume of brain areas like the prefrontal cortex, or alterations in neurotransmitter systems, those brain chemicals, and signs of oxidative stress, just like you mentioned.
The prefrontal cortex, that's huge for thinking, planning, impulse control, isn't it?
Exactly. So changes there in animals could be really relevant to the attention and hyperactivity concerns in kids.
Okay. Now, there were some studies from Japan mentioned, looking at specific dyes.
Yes, a research group in Japan did a series of studies on several dyes we use here, too. And what's really noteworthy is, for 3 of those dyes, they found behavioral effects at doses below the levels that cause general toxicity.
Below the levels used to set the current FDA limits.
Right, below the levels that form the basis for the ADIs. So, seeing behavioral effects at seemingly safer levels.
But the review said there were some limitations in directly applying those Japanese studies to kids' risks.
Correct. While they're valuable for showing a potential hazard, the way the studies were done looking at reproduction sometime, dosing across life stages, dosing right before testing, makes it tricky to do a direct risk assessment for children's dietary exposure.
Got it. Lab exposure isn't quite real-world eating. What about U.S. animal studies?
We had noted most U.S. studies specifically on neurobehavior were older, pre-1987. But they did point out some early FDA-backed studies on yellow number 5, red number 3, and red number 40 that did report behavioral effects, especially for red 3 and red 40 after long-term exposure.
So, hints even back then. And more recent U.S. animal work.
More recent stuff tends to focus more on how the mechanisms, like investigating effects on the serotonin system or looking for that oxidative stress in the brain we talked about.
Right, connecting back to the antioxidant findings, possibly.
Exactly. Starts building a picture. Now, we've talked mostly about single dyes. What about mixtures? Because that's how we usually consume them, right?
Yeah, rarely just one dye in a food.
Right. And Oisha looked at those too. Some early studies used mixtures mimicking typical U.S. exposure then. Newer ones might use doses based on multiples of the ADIs.
And what did those mixture studies show in animals?
The ones most relevant for kids' exposure. They found effects on regulating motor activity in young rats at doses near or even below the current ADIs for the dyes in the mixture.
So again, echoing those hyperactivity concerns from the human side, even with mixtures and at levels close to what's considered acceptable.
That seems to be the signal, yeah. Whether single dyes or mixtures, the animal research points towards potential behavioral impacts, often related to activity.
Okay, so Oisha then did this comparison, right?
Yeah.
Taking the effect levels from these newer studies and putting them side by side with the levels used to set the old FDA ADIs.
Yes, and this is where it gets really pointed. They looked at the evidence for each dye.
What did they find?
Okay, so for red number 3, a developmental study found a NOAL, a no effect level, for increased activity in offspring. If you use that level to set a new ADI, with the usual safety factor,
Yeah.
it would be 10 times lower than the current FDA ADI.
Wow, 10 times. That's a big gap.
It is. And other studies on red number 3 also found no effect levels below the current ADI.
Okay, what about others? Red 40, yellow 5.
For red num 40, the lowest dose linked to memory impairment and those prefrontal cortex changes in rats. It was the same as the current FDA ADI.
No buffer zone there at all.
Seems like it. And yellow number 5, similar story. The lowest dose linked to learning memory issues and prefrontal cortex changes in rats was the same as, or maybe even lower than, the FDA ADI.
Okay, so based on recent animal brain data, those ADIs look tight or maybe not protective enough.
Exactly. And then they went back to that human study, row and row 94 with yellow number 5.
Right, the dose response one.
And the level where they saw no adverse effect in those kids, it was over 100 times lower than the current US FDA ADI for yellow number 5.
100 times. In humans, that's really striking.
It is. And they noted other human studies also showing effects with yellow number 5 at doses below the ADI.
What about yellow number 6?
Less direct neurobehavioral data on the dye itself. But they highlighted a study on one of its metabolites, sulfonylic acid, which suggested the current ADI might not be protective there either.
So across the board for several major dyes, the newer science, human and animal, suggests the current safety levels might be too high if we're considering neurobehavioral effects.
That's the strong implication from OISH's comparison, yes.
Did they look at actual estimated intakes? Like, are kids actually consuming enough to hit these levels of concern?
They did. They used data from national surveys, like NIH's, to estimate exposures. For most dyes, typical intake seemed to be below the current ADIs.
Okay.
But red number 3 was an exception. Estimates for younger kids sometimes went above the ADI set by JECA, that's the International Food Additive Committee.
So even based on typical diets, some young kids might be exceeding at least one international safety benchmark for red number 3.
It appears possible, yes, based on those estimates.
Okay. We touched on histamine, oxidative stress. Did the review mention other ways these dyes might be working, other mechanisms?
Yeah, they briefly covered a few other possibilities being explored. Things like messing with hormone systems, endocrine effects, interfering with how neurons develop, maybe effects secondary to just general toxicity, immune system effects too, and maybe interfering with nutrient absorption. Plus, that whole area of the gut-brain axis, the connection between digestion and brain function, is getting a lot of attention.
Wow, it sounds really complex, lots of potential angles. So given all this, what did OISHA say needs to happen next? What more research is needed?
They laid out several key areas. More animal testing that really mirrors the human studies, better understanding of toxicokinetics, how the body handles these days.
Okay.
More work on the mechanisms, definitely. Understanding that genetic susceptibility better. And importantly, more rigorous clinical trials in kids, maybe looking closer at dose per body weight, and studies on long-term repeated exposure.
So still lots to learn, even though the current evidence points in a pretty clear direction. Okay, let's bring this home. As we wrap up, thinking about our listener, what's the single most important takeaway from this huge OISHA review?
I think the core message is that the science we have now strongly suggests a link between synthetic food dyes and adverse neurobehavioral effects in some children.
Right.
And crucially, these effects might be happening at exposure levels that our current safety guidelines, based on older data, may not adequately cover.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now and the information you take in about food every day?
Well, it really raises a question to think about, doesn't it? Given these findings, are there maybe small shifts in awareness you might consider? Perhaps just becoming a bit more conscious of ingredient lists, on foods, even some medications. Feeling okay about asking more questions.
Yeah, it's not about panic, but maybe just more informed curiosity.
Exactly. The science here is definitely still evolving, it's moving forward, but hopefully this deep dive gives you a valuable perspective on a topic that really does touch a lot of families and maybe empowers you to be even more informed.